So a couple weeks ago, I put a post on the community tab of my YouTube channel asking for comments and questions related to some of the content I've covered so far, the arguments for the existence of God and things like that. And I got some good responses back, so I figured what I'd do is I'd respond to them in video. So here we go. How is it that the Bible gives detailed explanations on how to own slaves, clear instruction on what's okay to do to them and not okay to do to them, and how to transfer them and so on, and why so many people think the Bible is anti-slavery? Someone responded to this comment pointing out that this isn't really the kind of content I've been covering on this channel so far. After all, I've mostly been keeping my discussions and my videos to the arguments on the existence of God. And this obviously wouldn't disprove that God exists. It wouldn't disprove the existence of God to point out that the Bible, if it did advocate for slavery, advocates for slavery. But, I mean, I'm a Catholic, and I believe in biblical infallibility, and I also think slavery is bad. So even if this isn't an objection to the existence of God, it could be considered an objection to my opinion, so my position. So I do feel like I have some kind of obligation to respond to it. And I think, from what I understand, there's a couple different ways I could go approaching this question and trying to respond to it. The first point I guess I should make is that when the Bible talks about slavery, as far as I understand, it uses a different understanding of slavery than what we think of in an American context. It's not talking, for example, about chattel slavery or slavery where one human being is considered the property of another. It's not talking about that. Instead, in the context of the time and place where the Bible was written, the term slavery referred more to what we Americans would think of as indentured servitude, or one man selling his service to another because of some kind of desperate circumstance. So if, my farm wasn't doing well and I needed a way to support myself and my family, maybe I would say to another man, I will sell my service to you for the next 7 years or so that you have complete discretion over how my work and my labor is used, but I still have my own personal rights and stuff. I'm not selling my personal rights. I'm doing this to support my family because I'm in this really desperate situation. So I think when we talk about biblical slavery, it's more similar to that kind of situation than chattel slavery across the board. But even if biblical slavery was talking about chattel slavery, and I don't think it is, I would still say that it doesn't support slavery. I would say that we see a progression from the Old Testament to the New Testament that shows a kind of gradual understanding that God is revealing that slavery is bad. So I think a good parallel for this is what the Catholic Church understands about divorce. The Catholic Church says that divorce has always been wrong. It's never been okay. But the Old Testament and the Old Law allowed for divorce because of what Jesus says, the hardness of people's hearts back then. And it was only in the New Testament that Christ came along and he said, you know how Moses allowed divorce? That was only because of the circumstances of the time. God never really wanted divorce. He just allowed it to exist for a time, and he created laws about how to regulate it because he knew that if he just came out and said divorce is bad, then people wouldn't listen to him. So in the same way, God in the Old Testament allowed the institution of slavery to exist and created rules and regulations about it in order to not scare off this people that he wanted to use as a vessel to bring the gospel to the world. So that's how I would respond to the idea that the Bible supports the institution of slavery. I honestly just don't think it does. And I would actually say in the same way that, very similar to how in the New Testament we see Christ say, from the beginning it was not so when it comes to divorce, and divorce is no longer allowed. Paul's letter to Philemon, actually, you can see hints of how Christianity was moving away from the institution of slavery, because Paul seems to subtly hint to at Philemon he's writing to, that this slave he's writing about, Onesimus, I think that's how you say his name, should be freed, and that Philemon, out of a Christian charity, should free his slave. So we have this sense in the New Testament that slavery and Christianity might be incompatible. So that's how I'd answer this question. The same commenter actually asks another question too. And this one is more like what I've been doing on this channel so far. He says, you always mention that God has to be singular. And that's right. That's the doctrine of divine simplicity, which all Catholics and I think most other Christians believe. It's the idea that God can't have any parts. There's no parts in God. So anytime we attribute something to God, we're attributing it to his nature, not to some part of him. And you go on to say that in order to differentiate between two things, that there has to be something that one of them has that the other one lacks. My question would be this: is this way of differentiating between things suspended in the Trinity? In other words, I think what he's asking is there a conflict between the doctrine of divine simplicity, which teaches that God doesn't have any parts, and the doctrine of the Trinity, which is, again, a Catholic belief and a Christian belief that God is divisible, I guess you might say, into the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? And this is a great question, and I love talking about this stuff. So I'm gonna say a few points in response to this. The first thing I want to say is that we have to remember that God has always been understood to be transcendent. What that means is when we talk about God, if we ever attribute anything to him, like goodness or power or knowledge or anything like that, we need to understand that the way we're attributing goodness or power or knowledge or anything to God is analogous to how we talk about goodness or power or knowledge or anything here. God is so far above us that his goodness is not exactly the same kind of thing as our goodness. It's infinitely more good than our conception of goodness, or his knowledge is infinitely more knowing than our conception of knowledge. We don't experience the same level of goodness or knowledge or power that God has ever in this life. So really, all we can do when we talk about God is kind of point at what his knowledge or his goodness or his power would look like. So when we say that God is good, we can't mean it in exactly the same way that we mean it when we say that, say, like Mother Teresa or Gandhi is good or something like that, because God's goodness is so far above any of the good things we experience in this world. That's called the principle of analogy. The idea that every time we talk about God, any term we use positively of God must be used analogously. We must understand that there is a fundamental difference between our conception of this term we're using in this world and what that word means when applied to God. But there is some similarity in those two things. I hope that makes sense there. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that principle of analogy to persons. When we talk about the Trinity, we have to understand that the Trinity says that there's three persons in one God, three persons, one nature. But persons is a very analogous term when it comes to God. When we say that God is three persons, or the Father is a person, the Son is a person, we don't mean it in exactly the same way we mean it when we say Bob is a person or Fred is a person. Because God's personality, his personhood, is so far above our personhood that it's only really analogous in a way to our personhood. It's almost better to say God is three super persons or something like that. All that's just a caveat. You see, the Trinity states that God is one nature in three persons. That means that he's one being. The being of God is what has to be perfectly simple. Because being, if you have infinite being, which is perfectly simple, that's classical theism. That's divine simplicity. The persons of the Trinity are really just different relations in the one nature of God, the one being of God. And that's probably the most I could do in terms of answering this objection, because at the end of the day, the Trinity is probably the most complicating and most high above us that theology ever really gets. Trying to understand the very nature of God, there's a reason that philosophers like Thomas Aquinas said that using philosophy alone, we can really only make negative statements about God, like saying that he doesn't lack any power or doesn't lack any goodness or anything like that. Making positive statements about God is really more of the realm of theology. And, I'm more skilled in philosophy than I am in theology. If I'm anything at all, I'm a philosopher, not a theologian. He wants me to do a video on the basics of Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics, which he says, and he points out correctly, that this kind of metaphysics is the basis of most of the arguments for God that I presented on this channel. And that's 100% correct. I mean, after all, I think, here's my bold claim. I think that it could be correct to say that if Aristotelian metaphysics is true, if it's true that things like act and potency and Thomistic metaphysics, but existence and essence and the four causes and things like that, if those are real features of the world, I think it follows like almost immediately that God exists. Because so many of the arguments for God, the classical arguments for God, are based on these principles of Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics. So yes, I will be covering Thomistic metaphysics more in the future. I will be doing entire videos on it in the future. I'm not going to get into that now. But this is the final question I'll talk about. And I think this is interesting. And I'm going to have to punt on it too. But this is what Either Spark asks. He asks my view on second stage arguments. The second stage theistic arguments. And what he means here is in every argument for God, any good argument for God, I think, really has two stages. First, you have to reason from things you see in the world to a being which is somehow different from anything we see in this world. So take the argument for morality. The argument for morality argues from the existence of moral truths to the idea that there has to be a being which is all good, which doesn't have any evil, which is different from the beings we see in this world, which are only somewhat good. Or the argument from contingency argues from the existence of the contingent beings we see around us to the existence of a necessary being, which is fundamentally different from all these contingent beings we see in the world. Or the argument from efficient causality, Aquinas' second way, argues from the existence of things which are comprised of both essence and existence to the existence of something which has no distinction between its essence and its existence, which is just existence. Its essence is existence. And what the next part of that argument is, the next part of any good argument for God, is taking those beings that we said from each of these arguments have to be totally different from anything we see in the world, and showing that those beings must be God. In other words, that they must have the certain divine attributes we associate with God, like being all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, infinite, timeless, changeless, immaterial, things like that. And Either Sparks is right, that I kind of, all my videos in Existence for God, I kind of brush past that part. I do it quickly. And the reason for that is it's kind of a practical thing for me, because if I gave a full explanation of why these beings we arrive at, like the necessary being, or the all-good being, or the being whose essence just is existence. If I gave a full explanation of why that being must be God, then it would like double the length of my video, and every video would also get really repetitive because those arguments start looking really similar in the different arguments for God. There's a lot of similarities. So out of practicality, I'm punting that whole discussion to a series of future videos I hope to do on each of the divine attributes. Like, why must God be all-knowing? Why must God be all good? Explaining why the necessary being we arrive at in the argument from contingency, or the being which is pure actuality we arrive at in the argument from motion, why those beings or other beings we arrive at in other arguments for the existence of God must be the God of classical theism. And if you want to see those videos when they come out, consider subscribing to this channel. This has been a little filler video for me that I did because I'll be away next week, but I really enjoyed getting these comments and responding to them. So thank you, and please follow this channel in the future.